Justice Nambiar, my good friend Professor Raj Kumar, who, as he said, I've known pretty much all his adult life, our Chief Secretary, Shri V.P. Joy, my good friend for a very long time, Venu Rajamani, and Shri Sudhir Mishra, distinguished, and of course Upasana, who's conducting this show with such aplomb, as well as members of the audience, friends. I hope that covers everybody. Ellavarikkum ende vinithamaya namaskaram. This is a terrific occasion that Raj has roped me into. The Kerala Sustainability Conclave is what this is all about, and the O.P. Jindal Global University in Haryana has chosen Kerala to take this theme forward. So I'm very glad that Raj has done that, and I want to echo Venu's words in saying how valuable it is that this university, which is far away in another state, has taken the trouble to show respect for and involvement with the extraordinary work that's going on in our state. And I think the presence of the Chief Secretary and the presiding of this function by a judge of the Kerala High Court are both ample testimony of that. Now, the theme that Raj wanted me to address in this inaugural address is the role of our universities in promoting sustainability. And as someone who's grappled with the implications of the rapidly escalating climate crisis from both a policy perspective, especially as an MP representing a particularly vulnerable constituency, we all know, we've all read the alarmist stories about how half of Thiruvananthapuram is going to be underwater in 30 years if the world carries on like this. And given my background, of course, as a former minister in what used to be called the Human Resources Department Ministry, really the Education Ministry, to my mind, the link between universities and the conversation on sustainability is obvious. It's already a reality. The fact that universities have a vital role to play, most obviously from a mere awareness perspective, was reaffirmed as recently as 2 years ago when the UN conducted its largest ever survey on opinions about climate change. Of the 1.2 million respondents who participated in the UN's People's Climate Vote, as the survey was titled, over 64% agreed with the basic premise that climate change represented a global emergency. But what's perhaps more relevant to our conversation today is that the survey once again established a clear connection between the quality and length of an individual's education and their belief in climate change. In an era where climate change denialists continue to impede sustained action, the survey showed us that whether it was in low or middle income countries like Bhutan and Congo, or high income counterparts like France and Japan, over 80% of the respondents who held university degrees or were in the middle of their studies, their higher education, tended to agree that climate change was indeed a global emergency. But awareness alone is not enough. Indeed, universities and colleges across the world are not merely informing and shaping opinions of future generations in a passive way. Recent developments suggest that universities are willing to play an active leadership role in pushing the conversation on sustainability and climate action. These range widely. There are concerned practical efforts like implementing steps to reduce their respective carbon footprints and develop more sustainable campuses, to formalizing partnerships with their counterparts through networks like the International Universities Climate Alliance. They also include campaigns like the UN's Race to Zero or collaborations with independent civil society bodies like the Alliance for Sustainability Leadership in Education, which made headlines when it presented a letter co-signed by 7,000 universities from across the world with dedicated commitments to reduce emissions and expand resources for climate action. Through these wide-ranging actions, universities across the world have indicated they're not going to limit themselves to knowledge and capacity building alone, but evolve into active stakeholders. And I'm pleased to note that O.P. Jindal Global University, under Rajkumar's leadership, has been very much a front runner in India among these trend-setting universities after making dedicated efforts to implement the practical aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN within their own campuses, and documenting their progress through the first edition of their report on Sustainable Development Goals, which was released, in fact, last year during the middle of the pandemic. Now, actions like these suggest that a positive trend is emerging with universities, an acknowledgement of the responsibility that such spaces have in promoting time-bound and comprehensive action on the challenges of sustainability. In fact, sustainability has in recent times also emerged as criterion or framework through which prospective students have made choices regarding the campus of their choice and to decide where they will spend most of the formative years of their lives. It's no accident that Upasana is in charge of admissions. So sustainability will attract more students, Upasana, to apply to you and add to your workload, I'm sure. I would argue that there are a number of concerns in regard to this. And perhaps some people will not particularly agree with the value of the formalized ranking systems which always make it to the news in our countries. But established ranking agencies like the Times Higher Education Supplement or the QS, Quacquarelli-Simons rankings, have created a separate and dedicated sustainability criterion while developing their widely read rankings year on year. So universities seeking to woo prospective students have now realized that the discerning applicant is now looking beyond the usual metrics of reputation, curriculum, faculty, and post-graduation opportunities, and is now also evaluating campuses through the prism of ethical considerations, including the institution's commitment to sustainability. Now, the larger point that such examples suggest is that in many ways universities are beginning to recognize that they can no longer remain somewhat passive institutions where merely a formal education is provided. There is welcome appreciation amongst these bodies that even in matters of sustainability, just attempting to increase our knowledge on these matters from a scientific perspective or adopting an approach that looks at such problems as abstract or theoretical knowledge exercises is not going to be sufficient if you seek to propel inspired action. Rather, such examples indicate a newfound willingness within educational institutions to commit themselves to action in a more holistic, real-time, and concrete manner. So I don't know if Sudhir Mishra is going to be bringing a lot of postcards to the Jindal campus, but the example he gave us of how that worked with the Delhi High Court is something which also shows you how action can follow from awareness. Now, this is an important and timely development, for as the Harvard professor Ronald Ferguson, author of Educating Children to Improve the World, has rightly argued, and I quote, "The motivation to invent more sustainable ways of life requires more than an understanding of the science of climate change, the capacity to design technological universities, or technological innovations, I beg your pardon, or an ethical framework that helps us aspire to live in more inclusive and sustainable communities. It also requires an understanding of social systems and the development of ethical reasoning that can help us integrate critical thinking about the current impact of climate change, our moral imagination, the personal motivation to act, and our competence to act in effective ways," unquote. So this approach, one that is cognizant of the complex social and moral underpinnings and the push towards sustainability, has been recognized by the Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which in its 2014 report underscored this point by arguing, and I'll quote again, "Differences in vulnerability and exposure arise from non-climatic factors and from multidimensional inequalities often produced by uneven development processes. These differences shape differential risks from climate change. This heightened vulnerability is rarely due to a single cause. Rather, it's a product of intersecting social processes that result in inequalities in socioeconomic status and income, as well as in exposure," unquote. This is a point worth repeating in the context of today's deliberations on the role of universities. Because when we raise and equip future generations of our country to grapple with problems of this magnitude and complexity, as all of you young people in this room will do as you reach university and beyond, we must ground you all in an appreciation of such realities. Students from countries like ours, especially, cannot afford to forget that any conversation on sustainability and climate action must, in societies with complex and deep-rooted social and economic challenges such as ours, be cognizant of the need to look at these problems as a whole, in a holistic manner, a manner that allows students to identify and work with the myriad deeply rooted influences of privilege, access, and equality that come together under the umbrella of climate justice. That is the manner in which universities must equip our students as they venture forth into the world and attempt to build a more sustainable way forward for our communities. For instance, teaching them that the crisis of air pollution affects you and I differently from someone whose economic circumstances compels them to continue relying on polluting energy sources within their house to cook a meal. These women, for example, particularly in northern India, but also in parts of the south, who are burning firewood or cow dung patties inside a kitchen without any ventilation to cook for their families, and who are destroying their lungs in the process over years. Now, that is an example of an unavoidable health cost that the more affluent do not have to pay. And it's a simple example of the kind of inequality that even creeps into the environmental issue. Or take the recognition that rising sea levels and coastal erosion, which is not an abstract topic for those of us living in Kerala, is a lived everyday reality for vulnerable communities like coastal groups, especially the fisher folk who are children of the sea and make their living from it right here in Thiruvananthapuram, whose lives are completely upended by these phenomena. And teaching them to recognize that even the most well-intentioned mitigating action, whether it's from a government or through action by civil society bodies, can only succeed in a country like ours if we adopt a pragmatic approach that is inclusive of such social and moral considerations. Let me take an example closer to home. If all of you are from Thiruvananthapuram, there's an issue of great importance to parts of my constituency, and that is the implication of the ESA, Ecologically Sensitive Area Notification on the Western Ghats, which is responsible for demarcating certain zones and disallowing various kinds of activities, human habitation, and so on in them. In principle, this is a necessary and positive development. But the current notification has included the villages of Kallikad, Amburi, and Vaichal, which are manifestly not eligible under the rules of the scheme, thereby causing great anxiety amongst the local residents who mainly live on sustainable activities like agriculture. With my help as their MP, they've made multiple representations and interventions with the ministry in Delhi, whose careless inclusion of their villages as ecologically sensitive areas has presented significant challenges of economic disruption and physical displacement to my constituents who know no other home. So I'm digressing, but the point is that universities across the world must recognize that these issues are complex and they have a special responsibility to equip future leaders with the capacity to look at all of these considerations in tandem while talking, and more importantly, while acting on sustainability. In order for us to successfully do so, it is important for universities to reassess the manner in which they train and raise our students. In previous interventions on the role of higher education, I've long been inspired by the arguments of Cardinal John Henry Newman, who pointed out in 1852 in his famous collection of essays on the idea of a university that the purpose of our universities, of our institutions, must be to develop for our students knowledge that grasps what it perceives through the senses, which takes a view of things, which sees more than the senses convey, which reasons upon what it sees, and while it sees, which invests it with an idea. And he goes on to add that an education that ultimately leaves our students with a comprehensive view of truth in all its branches, of the relations of science to science, of mutual bearings, of respective values, of science to daily life and humanities, all of these are important points. I think it's very important for us to revisit this 170-year-old wisdom from Cardinal Newman, because the truth is that when we talk about sustainability, These words remind us that universities must build up a certain capacity among students to be able to examine the foundational truths of our respective communities in a manner that looks at all branches and all relations. Or as Cardinal Newman would go on to say himself, to develop the power of viewing many things as one, at once, as one whole, of referring them severally to their true place in the universal system, of understanding their respective values and determining their mutual dependence. So seemingly disconnected things are all connected to each other if you see them as a whole and you understand where they all fit in. And sustainability is about that. It's about our planet as a whole. Now, the principal challenge presented by our current higher education system, which has placed a premium on overly technical and utilitarian education, is that it has sadly developed a generation of graduates who are trained to look at the problems of the world through absolute and non-negotiable principles. This works, this doesn't work. This switch turns off, this turns on. There's only one way of doing things and no other. That's what all the engineers and doctors and so on have been taught over the years. Now, I think this would be disastrous in the context of sustainable futures. And I turn back to the example of the essay notification that I mentioned earlier, which illustrates this challenge. By approaching the conversation on sustainability from a rigid one-size-fits-all approach that is devoid of the human context, we risk developing situations that will be inherently unsustainable, almost by design. Universities need to temper science with the humanities, to temper theory with reality. If our graduates are rooted in the idea that there's only one way to think and work, they are likely to apply that habit of mind and thought to their understanding of human beings, of politics, of ideology, and indeed of the environment. And they proceed to develop solutions based on the premise that only one worldview is true and right, and everyone else is wrong. This is why I'm so glad a High Court judge is here, because Justice Nambiar knows perfectly well. The law may be very explicit, but there is always room for interpretation. There is always application in context. There is a taking into awareness of the specific social realities that are being adjudicated. And in that process, you cannot treat the application of judgments and the application of law purely as a science. It is also an art. And that is very, very important for all of us to appreciate. And the same logic comes to the environment and sustainability. As I've often argued when talking about the role of higher education, it's an argument that I believe is worth revisiting in this conversation, is that the human mind is like a parachute. It functions best when it is open, right? You don't want to jump off a plane with a parachute that will remain closed. And similarly, we cannot produce graduates who will attempt to address the great problems of our country with a closed mind. Our traditional utilitarian approach in India has been to shove facts into the students from school onwards, and college of course, and make them memorize stuff which they then regurgitate in the examinations. If this was already out of date when it was being inflicted on the likes of me, it is most definitely totally out of date for all of you and for our aspiring graduates of today, because in the 21st century, a world characterized by hostility, stratified societies, narrow-minded identities, and at the same time great technological innovation and change, what we desperately need is not a well-filled mind. Today in the real world, you can find any fact that you need with 2 clicks of a mouse. What we need is not a well-filled mind, but a well-formed mind. A mind that is able to adapt to unfamiliar information and decide how to deal with it. Equally, it remains important that we don't teach you all what to think, rather that we teach you how to think, so that you can make the new understandable, bring the distant near, make the unfamiliar into something you can handle. We need individuals who are able to react to unfamiliar information or to discover new information and know how to understand it, how to fit it into a pattern, how to understand the problems and dilemmas that information poses, and how to approach solutions for these problems. Only such individuals will be able to successfully navigate the confluence of interests and concerns that must be heeded while developing a more sustainable future for our society. To my mind, by adopting such an approach, universities can play a unique role in pushing the conversation on sustainability forward. At the same time, in order to foster the social and moral understanding of these problems, it is imperative that universities in themselves remain inclusive and representative spaces, so the perspectives of our students are forged with a deeper appreciation of those who do not have the same background or do not subscribe to their views or who face a different set of economic realities in such matters. After all, no conversation on this subject can sustain itself if it does not carve out spaces for all voices, no matter how big or small, to be heard. This is not just what we try to rectify through instruments like affirmative action and need-based scholarship programs, which of course are very important, and I believe you have them, Raj, right? You do offer scholarships. But a commitment to really taking stock of the barriers to access and inclusion that permeate all levels of our society. As has been recognized under Goal 4 of the Sustainable Development Goals, ensuring inclusive and equitable education is an integral component in our shared vision for a more sustainable future. I believe that if we are successful in raising the next generation, that is you all, in a manner that builds your capacity to think beyond the traditional approach of doing things and in a manner that allows you to work in tandem with other stakeholders through collaboration and dialogue, we may yet be able to push the conversation on sustainability forward in an unprecedented manner. As part of that journey, universities must continue to build on the leadership and action that they've shown thus far. And I want to congratulate Jindal on this report that we have all just released this afternoon, and to congratulate them on the action they have taken so far. And I urge them to actively support and train future graduates to approach these problems with the level of nuance and commitment that such challenges require. With those words, I thank you all for your attention. I'm pleased to declare this Kerala Sustainability Conclave formally inaugurated. Jai Hind.